Hello, mic test. Good afternoon to all our friends from the media. Welcome to the second day of our sideline press conferences to the APEC finance-related meetings here in Cebu. For this round of press conference, we have two very important speakers. First is Mr. Sanjeev Gupta. He is the Deputy Director for the Fiscal Affairs Department of the IMF. And Mr. Shanaka Peiris, IMF's Resident Representative to the Philippines. So in this morning's session, delegates expounded on the 4 pillars of the Cebu Action Plan. And Mr. Gupta participated in the session on the second pillar, which is fiscal reforms and transparency. So he will give us an opening statement on the highlights of his discussions earlier, and then we will open the floor to questions. If there are also questions specifically about the Philippines, Mr. Peiris will be able to answer that. So, Mr. Gupta?
Thank you, Mitch. And what I'm going to do is to summarize for you what I presented during this session that Mitch referred to. And the session was on advancing transparency and fiscal reforms. And so my focus was on 2 interrelated issues. First was on, of course, on ensuring transparency in budget operations of the government, and then making a push for infrastructure by improving efficiency of public investment. And these 2 issues are, as I said, are interrelated, as transparency of fiscal operations has a bearing on how efficiently you use public resources for public investment. And so the background for this, why we focused on these issues, was that our experience with the recent financial crisis was that during this period, number of countries, I'm referring here to the advanced economies, experienced unexpected increases in debt to GDP ratio. That is, their debt increased much larger than what they had anticipated. And so this happened because government did not know fully the unreported deficits arising from activities such as PPPs, that is public-private partnerships, and the operations of state-owned enterprises, and also because they built up some expenditure areas, and there was emergence of some large, what we call contingent liabilities. And so we in the IMF revised our code of fiscal transparency in light of the developments, and introduced a new instrument called fiscal transparency evaluation. And so we have done 13 evaluations, including 3 in APEC economies. And the reports are published and are available on the IMF's external website. And so there are 5 key lessons that come out of these evaluations so far. One lesson is that countries often report much less of the fiscal operations of the public sector than they should. More than 20% of the spending has not been reported in many of the countries. And the operations of public corporations is a major omission in the reporting system. Second, there are major gaps in the balance sheet. That is, they don't fully report all the liabilities, and of course, they don't really report the full extent of their assets either. Third, they make very optimistic fiscal forecasts for the medium term, which means their medium-term budgeting is not very credible. They are generally very optimistic about the evolution of spending by understating the spending plans going forward. And finally, or the fourth, there's a large contingent liabilities, such as arising from public-private partnerships, pensions, and the guarantees that governments actually provide that are not reported in the accounts. And finally, there is the issue of lack of transparency in some of the project appraisal systems that has a bearing on public investment. So then this leads me to the second issue that I spoke about, which is the efficiency of public investment processes. So what we have found is that if one looks at the data of 120 countries, we find that roughly 1/3 of the investment potential impact is being lost through inefficiencies. So in other words, if you are spending $1, you are losing roughly 1/3 of that money through inefficient investment. And so, and we found that across 120 countries, there is an average efficiency gap of about 27%. For APEC economies, this gap is somewhat lower at about 20%. So if one were to strengthen the investment processes, then one can improve or reduce this efficiency gap that I talked about. And for this purpose, we have introduced a new tool, public investment management assessment, to help countries deal with the weaknesses in the investment processes. And we carried out assessments in about 40 countries, of which 11 are APEC economies. And so what we see is that in case of APEC economies, they lie in between the advanced economies and the emerging economies. So their weaknesses are not as bad as that of emerging markets taken as a whole, but still there are some weaknesses which can be dealt with, and they pertain mainly to one of the particular phases of investment, which is the planning stage, where there is less of a coordination between center and states, which is what one would like to see. And so strengthening some of these institutions that I mentioned can help APEC economies to achieve the infrastructure pillar, which is defined under the Cebu Action Plan. So the key messages that we came up with was strengthen fiscal transparency and improve the quality of public investment, and we at the IMF stand ready to help the countries in achieving these objectives, and also thereby the pillars of the Cebu Action Plan. Thank you.
Okay, we are now opening the floor to questions. So for our media friends who would like to ask questions, you may raise your hand. Allow me to acknowledge you. Proceed to the microphone. Identify yourself and your affiliation. Yes, please.
My name is Ethel Natera. I'm with the Cebu Provincial Government, the Public Information Office. There has been much talk about I'd like to address this question to Mr. Sanjeev. There's been much talk about the Cebu Action Plan. How significantly can the Cebu Action Plan help in pursuing the goal of efficient and prudent public spending?
The action plan, in a way, is presenting a path for the governments, and it is for them to pursue different policies which would improve the efficiency of spending. And there were a number of ideas that have been presented and discussed in the meeting, which will go a long way in meeting the goals of the Cebu Action Plan. For example, if one were to focus on, let's say, as I discussed earlier, on the efficiency of public investment, and you were to focus on strengthening some of the key weaknesses which have been identified for some of the APEC economies, then this would lead to an improvement in the efficiency of spending.
Who would like to ask the next question? Okay. Yeah.
Hi, I'm Kathleen Martin from the Philippine Star. This is addressed to Mr. Gupta and also to Mr. Peiris. In the case of the Philippines, can you name some weaknesses in infrastructure spending, and how can the government improve on this? Thank you.
Thank you. As Mr. Gupta said, the fiscal and transparency evaluation and the assessment on public investment, they're kind of linked, and it's all about improving transparency, accountability, and efficiency of spending. So in both these cases, in a sense, Philippines is a good example where the evaluations had been done. The fiscal transparency evaluation is already on the website, and you already have seen it, and it identified certain areas where lots of progress has been made on transparency, budgeting, execution, but there are some challenges left. And I think you've seen that based on the transparency evaluation, the government has announced some additional steps and also measures it wants to take, including institutionalizing some of the reforms through legislative means. So actually, in a certain sense, it shows how these tools can be effective in countries. You have evaluation, countries, it's put out there, people discuss it, and then countries come up with their own roadmaps and plans, and often implement it with your help, who will be monitoring them as well. And that can lead to better outcomes in efficiency. So in a sense, the Cebu Action Plan, we discuss this when governments collectively agree to implement these. We see the effect potentially it might have on the Philippines, and it just shows that if countries collectively act on it, we could have a much bang for the buck, especially because APEC is a large part of the global economy.
Okay.
Hi, good afternoon. I'm Ben De Vera from Philippine Daily Inquirer. For Mr. Peiris, as you know, the Department of Finance is also pushing for a comprehensive tax reform package. And how do you think will it be in line with the Cebu Action Plan in case, the package is still being pitched for the President's approval, wherein there would be, they said that there would be some additional taxes. At the same time, income tax rates may be lowered or eased. So, do you think that could also be supported by the region-wide initiative like the Cebu Action Plan? And do you think such a comprehensive tax reform package would also benefit the Philippines? Would the IMF support such a move? Thank you.
Yeah. Maybe I'll just give the kind of Philippine-specific answer, and if Sanjeev wants to jump in, because there is a kind of link to the regional and APEC discussions. One of the, there are two pillars, right? One is advances fiscal transparency and reform, and financial resiliency, which, you want to have a good revenue base, so that, you are resilient to external shocks. So I think it's linked to the Cebu Action Plan and currently what's going on to have a strong revenue base. And as you know, tax to GDP in the Philippines is relatively low. So it's a relevant point how we can have tax reform for raising the revenues, but also making the system more efficient. Because rates are quite high, but tax collections are low. So we want to raise efficiency as well. So in that context, you would want a comprehensive tax reform, because there are, in many areas, which has been identified in many previous reports, including Article 4 missions, was that there are lots of exemptions and rates are quite high, so we could have much more broadening of the tax base while lowering rates, but we'll have to broaden it before lowering the rates, because otherwise you're taking a big risk with the revenues. So a comprehensive approach would seem the best way to do it. And we would support a very much a comprehensive report. The question is, of course, then the details, because you want it to be at least revenue neutral or revenue enhancing. And this is where it comes down to how it links to the Cebu Action Plan as well. One of the key discussions also is how to raise public investment. If you have a very low tax to GDP ratio, yes, you have a limit of how much public investment you can increase, because at some point you're going to hit to a deficit target or a debt limit which can be binding. So this is where to implement things for the Cebu Action Plan, like raising infrastructure spending by a certain percent of GDP, you really need the revenues, and also environment where the tax rates are conducive to private investment as well, including infrastructure.
Yes.
Good afternoon. I'm Mikhail Flores of Business World. My question is addressed to Mr. Sanjeev. Sir, many of the initiatives laid out in the second pillar of the Cebu Action Plan require short-term deliverables. How prepared are APEC economies in meeting these deliverables? Although, of course, APEC initiatives are non-binding and voluntary in nature, but should they decide to adopt the initiatives suggested in the Cebu Action Plan, how prepared are they, and what are the immediate interventions and reforms that APEC economies should undertake or should do in order to be able to meet the deliverables of the Cebu Action Plan? And also to Mr. Peiris, how prepared is the Philippines in meeting these deliverables, and what are the reforms still needed in order to meet this? Thank you.
I think, as you point out, whatever is envisaged under Cebu Action Plan, it is voluntary, it's not mandatory. But countries will do it because it is good for them, right? I mean, let's look at the global environment. The growth rates in the emerging markets are slowing down. The world economy hasn't really picked up after the financial crisis. So clearly, it is in the interest of all the countries to implement these reforms, because they would be good for growth. They will be good for the kind of things that Mr. Peiris talked about. It will generate more revenue. It will improve the efficiency of spending. So reforms are good for the countries. And so without any pressure, they will implement them, because in the end, they will generate some positive outcomes for them.
I think in the Cebu Action Plan on the fiscal side, there are areas which are revenue enhancing, like cooperating with exchange of information with tax authorities to avoid kind of profit shifting. Then there's also cooperation to kind of harmonize certain procedures. So on the revenue side, you can see the clear benefits. And on the expenditure side, the areas of like fiscal transparency, the idea is that you have these kind of benchmarks which are kind of best practice. And there's a lot of evidence, including from the studies we've done, is that you improve on the transparency or improve on the public investment management benchmarks, that actually leads to higher efficiency of spending. And we've shown in lots of studies that the efficiency, that also has much more of an impact on GDP or the economy as a whole. So as Sanjeev mentioned, you can see the benefits. If you can collectively agree on these are the benchmarks we want to move towards, this is how we get to a more efficient outcome, it'll be better for the world economy. And in the case of Philippines, public spending is quite low, and the efficiency, we know, because we are coming, most of the emerging markets have weaknesses, as Sanjeev mentioned, in the planning stage, and also in relations with the central government and the LGUs in the Philippines. So those are areas which have been identified and actually resonate with the Philippines as well. So actually the government has that information, and if we collectively say we want to move to these benchmarks which are globally seen as improving efficiency, that will hopefully make the systems, the plan, for example, on the expenditure side, the planning of investment planning and the better investment relations and investment coordination among the center and the LGUs, that will lead to more better execution, also better efficiency of the spending. So you can see how they're linked up.
Okay, Sig.
Yes, good afternoon. I'm Siegfried Delgado of Bloomberg News. For Mr. Gupta, thank you. Do you see public sector debt levels in APEC economies, particularly emerging market economies in the bloc, remaining healthy at the moment? And which countries do you think are most at risk given the current financial market rout? Moreover, how can these economies cushion any threat to their fiscal space?
The debt levels of the emerging markets are lower than that of advanced economies. In the advanced economies, they are close to 100% of the GDP. That said, what we have noticed is that the debt levels in the emerging economies still remain higher than what they were before the crisis. So what that has done is to limit the fiscal space that they have to withstand another crisis or a shock. So our advice has been to go back or at least try to restore the position they had before the crisis, so they have adequate fiscal buffers going forward.
Any more questions? I see Kai raised her hand earlier. Okay.
Sir, good afternoon. I'm Kai Ordinario from Business Mirror. I just wanted to ask regarding contingent liabilities. The Philippine government has a contingent liability fund to address contingent liabilities resulting from PPPs. Do you think the government allocated enough for that fund, and can that really absorb the possible liabilities that we could incur because of the PPPs?
So yes, the government does allocate a certain amount for contingencies, including PPPs. One of the outcomes of the fiscal and transparency evaluation on the Philippines was that the government recognized that there are some areas we need to work on, because a lot of work actually was done on estimating contingent liabilities as a part of the report. One of the few areas which we didn't go into too much detail was on PPP liabilities, because we couldn't go through all of the contracts themselves because they're quite different, so we had to value each one. But the key things which came out was that it's an area which we need to look at, especially because we are only starting to ramp up the PPPs right now. So, the liabilities are mainly legacy liabilities. So the new ones, really, it's still very early stages. So we have time to properly evaluate, estimate, and have a contingency fund for it. And one of the proposals, as a part of the response or the assessment on the evaluation, the Department of Budget and a number of senators and the congressmen have proposed a Public Financial Accountability Act. And that act envisages having a more detailed assessment and also a more risk-based approach to a contingency fund, which will be based on the probability of risk and how much the cost of contingency might be. So that's something which has been proposed by a number of, and it has been adopted by the administration as one of the proposed bills they would like to see. So it will be something for the future as well.
Okay, we have room for, I think, 2 more questions or 3 quick questions. Who else wants to ask? Yes, please.
Good afternoon, I'm Brian Evangelista of UNTV. I would like to ask Sir Sanjeev if there are consequences or impacts for these countries who are not reporting their 20% of spending, and if there are measures or sanctions for countries who are not reporting for their liabilities. Thank you, sir.
I think one of those things that we want in our budgeting is to have full reporting of all the activities. And the reason why we want to have full reporting is that if tomorrow something happens, one of the contingent liabilities is realized, it's presented to the government to be paid, then the government actually is prepared and is aware of those liabilities. So that is why we like to have a very comprehensive coverage of the budget and comprehensive reporting of the budget, because it allows government to know what kind of fiscal risk it is facing down the line. And so what we have found is that, as I said earlier, there are a number of countries where some 20% or so of the spending is not reported, and it's the case largely for public corporations whose operations are not covered by the government. So over time, and in Philippines as well, they do cover the general government, but some of the operations of the public corporations are not covered. So if you don't know what those corporations are doing, and if some liability is faced by the government, then it can easily, in some sense, affect the fiscal position of the government. So in that sense, it is good to have a comprehensive assessment of the government, but there is no immediate consequences. It is of not reporting these things. The main idea of reporting and having a good coverage is that it prepares you well for all the fiscal risk going forward.
Okay, we can accommodate 2 more questions. Yes, please.
Good afternoon, Ferliza Contratista of PIA Cebu. After the launching of the Cebu Action Plan tomorrow, what will be the next step for APEC to achieve higher quality of public investments?
As I said, Cebu Action Plan is voluntary, and basically the good practices are being noted in the action plan. So it is up to the governments then to move forward on those policies, and to the extent they end up implementing those policies going forward, there would be an positive impact on the economy. So the way the Cebu Action Plan is designed, it is not meant to be mandatory, and so it's really voluntary. And as I said earlier, it is in the interest of countries to follow good policies, because those policies will then yield positive outcomes.
Okay, is there any more question? One last question from the floor. Okay, if there is none, I will ask our 2 speakers to give a closing statement. So for your closing statement, may I ask you to wrap up this topic by answering this question. Economies right now are confronted with a lot of issues, such as financial market volatility. So why do you think the agenda of fiscal reforms and transparency be a priority, especially as stated by the Cebu Action Plan?
The reason why the agenda for fiscal transparency and fiscal reforms is critical for the countries is for some of the issues that we have discussed in the last half hour or so. One is that countries need resources to be able to build more infrastructure, to provide more social services, and so fiscal reforms will aid to achieve these objectives. And fiscal transparency will allow the countries to allocate resources in the right way, will keep the public informed of how the resources are being used, and also prepare the governments to meet any contingencies going forward. Would you like to add anything?
Only to say, also, I think in the case of the Philippines, also is a good example where fiscal transparency and also kind of openness creates awareness, including from the markets, of what the fiscal policies are of the countries. It anchors fiscal policy and expectations of markets. And if you can anchor expectations often when you have global shocks or even local shocks, because markets understand your fiscal accounts and you're transparent about it, might react less, and it makes the economy more resilient. And I mean, I think there's a lot of studies Fiscal Affairs Department has done in the IMF, which shows that there are real benefits to this transparency: lower borrowing costs, more resilience to shocks. So those are important aspects to keep in mind. So it is part of dealing with the global environment as well.
Okay, on that note, we would like to thank everyone for your active participation. This ends our round of press conference. I will see you again for another round at 5 p.m. Thank you.